infektiöse Erscheinung dar, die ansteckend wirkt. Deutschland jedenfalls hat nicht die...
It is January 1st, 1948, and now today is the most impactful day in all of human history. The Treaty of Geneva has now been signed between the remaining Allied forces, and they end their fighting. The pen is put to paper and it is made official. The Axis powers have won World War II. With the war over, it is now time for the victors to shape the world in their image. First, we shall discuss the Greater Germanic Reich that during the war directly annexed Austria, the Sudetenland, parts of Denmark, chunks of Poland, Alsace-Lorraine, half of Switzerland, and Luxembourg, with Bohemia and the general government as protectorates. The Reichskommissariats created by Germany include the Reichskommissariat Benelux, Norwegian, Schweiz, Ukraine, Caucasus, Ostland, and Muscovine. German puppets include the Vichy regime that expanded to include all of France, England, Scotland, Ireland, Slovakia, Serbia, and Turkmenistan. Next in the south, we have the new Roman Empire, who was able to annex Corsica, most of Albania, the Dalmatian coast, Crete, Turkey, Cyprus, and Arabia and Croatia and Greece were created as puppets. In Africa, parts of northern Africa and the Horn of Africa would become large colonies under Italian control, along with the Levant and Iraq. Spain was granted a small chunk of southern France and all of Portugal and its colonies, along with Morocco, to become a Neo-Iberian federation. The remaining chunk of Africa was annexed into a large Germanic region called Mittel Africa that would soon be repopulated and mined for its resources. Remaining South Africa became a puppet under German control, as well as spreading its newly created apartheid system to other Axis African colonies. Meanwhile, in Asia, Imperial Japan stands as the leaders of their continent. Japan directly annexed French Indochina, British Malaya, Hawaii, Australia, New Zealand, Sri Lanka, and parts of southern India, the Philippines, and Hong Kong, as well as keeping Taiwan, Korea, and the entire island of Sakhalin. Manchukuo would be expanded into the greater Manchurian region under the puppet leader Pu Yi. There was also a Mongolian puppet state under the control of Wang Jingwei. Indonesia, as well as Burma, were to become puppets under Japanese leaders. Thailand officially joined the Axis powers and gained some land from Burma. India united with Afghanistan and came under the control of a pro-Japanese puppet government and was dependent on Japan. But still, a mass exodus occurred when Japanese citizens traveled to new parts of their empire and influenced the region severely. Finally, the nations of the Americas, such as America, Canada, and Mexico, would form an economic and defensive alliance of countries protesting Axis control. This, however, would not be as influential in South America, as Peru and Brazil have mass Japanese populations and pro-Japanese leaders. Now we may see how each nation has adapted to its era under the New World Order. The Empire of Japan and the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, or the Chosen People of Asia. After a long while of fighting, they have finally achieved domination over the entire continent. In Malaya, all resources were directly controlled and seized by Japan. As Japanese-filled industrial towns sprung up, northwards, the reorganized National Republic of China's government was purely for show, as all its actions were made by the Japanese themselves. Japanese businesses moved to China and used its vast population as an endless source of cheap labor, with workers being paid almost nothing. In Indonesia, the Philippines, and Burma, a class system would be formed, with the Japanese elite at the top and natives at the bottom. Initial cooperation with the directly annexed regions would break down as more land was needed for settlement. In Korea, the brutal occupation and integration with Japan continued, with the culture of the Korean people on the verge of extinction. Japan's economy was booming, with the resources from across Asia available to only them as their navy tripled in size. Russian refugees poured into the empire, escaping the war against Germany. The Russians would be seen as lazy heathens. Even with all of China under Japanese control, the Kuomintang and Chinese communists would unite as a guerrilla force attempting to regain control of their homeland in China. Second, the Italian Empire. They have certainly succeeded in their ambitions. Mussolini's dream of restoring the Roman Empire and reuniting the entire Mediterranean under his control has come true. The Grand Council of Fascism would be under his control, and it would exercise absolute control of the entire country. By now, he would put forward the plan to create a Mediterranean alliance. It's called the Latin Bloc. But this alliance would be in the shadow of much larger powers, so almost no one would join it except Italy's puppets in Spain. Meanwhile, in Africa, a vast set of colonies would be set up by Italy, where the local population of these countries would be put into forced labor as they served their new overlords. But still, the Italian Empire is threatened by a much larger power to their north. And now we finally have the dominant, powerful Greater Germanic Reich. Adolf Hitler has finally achieved his ideological goal. All of Eastern Europe was under his new empire. The final solution, which started in 1941, would be only the beginning. These vast new lands were not empty. That would need to change if they were ever to be repopulated and incorporated into the Reich itself. So starting soon, the millions upon millions of Eastern Europeans would be enslaved, kidnapped, and killed. A mass genocide nearly 10 times worse than the Holocaust would occur. The largest extermination of all time would continue until Germany finally had her Lebensraum. But these people weren't going to go down without a fight. They knew the aim of the Nazis was to wipe out their entire populations and their culture. So resistance groups began to spark up against German forces. The Wehrmacht was believed to be the most powerful fighting force on the planet, yet by the 1950s all the Reich's eastern holdings were in complete rebellion. The fighting against these people would occur until the inevitable would happen. By 1955, Hitler would be dead at the age of 66. Now we need to deal with the problem of succession in his country. Hermann Göring was Hitler's designated successor, but it's unlikely his position would be given up so easily. Heinrich Himmler, who was the leader of the SS, would attempt to take control of the country. Factions would be made in the government and parties seemingly about to start a bloody conflict, as well as the realizations that the Nazi economy was built off of debt. They couldn't adapt to the times of peace. German industry is facing a crisis as a new strain came with the Eastern revolts. It became clear that the Nazi Party wouldn't be able to keep control and pay off the debts. Businesses in Germany began to go bankrupt and unemployment skyrocketed. The Nazi Party attempted to print millions of German marks into the debt pool, but this only leads to mass inflation. The crisis worsens as this country falls into civil war over succession, yet it was clear that whoever won still couldn't save Germany. The nations of the world would close their borders as millions of German refugees flooded out. The dream of an Aryan empire that would last 1,000 years was dead, and millions along with it. The collapse of Nazi Germany left revolutions to organize the region into free states. Germany and other parts of Europe would be occupied by America soon after. By 1961, Mussolini would have already died, and fascist Italy would have fallen into a collapse. The Grand Council of Fascism would attempt to maintain control and reform, but revolutions in Africa and Arabia would be too much to bear. Spain would also face mass unrest, then a coup would oust the fascist government from power. Japan would remain the only power left, but facing a large number of soldiers revolting against officers, Japanese reforms were halted after the Communist Kuomintang alliance was able to secure parts of China, and then invasions by American forces in the new free states of Germany and Italy. Finally, by the late 60s, Japan's empire would fall, and with it, so would the dream of an Axis world. But now, with the defeat of the Axis nations, we've reached a happy ending, right? But now this world has become one of war and deportation and misery. Nations in Eastern Europe will now have barely enough people to be run effectively. Europe will now be dependent on loans by America, and each nation will fight for only themselves. Countries and their leaders will be tolerated, but not loved, and masses of people will be traumatized by the crimes of these previous regimes. The Jews of Europe will become practically extinct, along with the other people the Nazis considered unworthy of life, such as Slavs, Gypsies, Russians, and many more. Places like Britain and Russia will permanently isolate themselves, while Italy and Germany will be reorganized into smaller and weaker states. All nations will be exhausted as their pre-war economies are now non-existent, and their populations are stuck in poverty. There will never be an UN or an EU, as each country will keep to themselves, and after the fall of the Axis powers, it is certain that Western civilization and the rest of the world would never be the same.